the threat of a nuclear doomsday haunts the nation.
The destructive power of the weapons is so vast.
In the Cold War, filmmaking is at the front lines of the arms race.
They were dealing with the most secret activities of the Cold War state.
Images of mushroom clouds put Americans face to face with the apocalypse. Civil defense propaganda sells the hope of survival.
The overall message of the civil defense films is if you're prepared, you'll survive.
While a top secret program struggles to capture the true power of the bomb.
The only reason why we have access to these images is because of a declassification process.
Cold War films tell the story of a world on the brink of annihilation. Alamogordo, New Mexico, the dawn of the atomic age. After 2 years and more than $2 billion, a massive scientific research project about to test a new weapon promising unimaginable destructive power. But even some of the world's most brilliant scientists have no idea how powerful the bomb will actually be, or if it will work at all.
On the night of the first test, there was incredible tension. Expectations ranged from a high of close to 50,000 tons of TNT to those who predicted 0.
Famed Italian physicist Enrico Fermi jokes that the blast will ignite the atmosphere, ending all life on Earth. Dozens of cameras are set up to film this first atomic explosion.
Film was crucial to the science of the bomb from the very first test. This wasn't just a matter of seeing what they could destroy with a sample bomb. They needed to measure it.
Only film could show them what's invisible to the human eye.
Most of what's happening that scientists need to know about and study is happening in milliseconds, right at the point of detonation at an atomic level reaction.
But even the team that built the bomb has no idea how to film it.
Los Alamos initially designed the weapon. They were also responsible for doing the photography. They had never tried to film a nuclear weapon before. A lot of people didn't know what to expect. They didn't know how bright the fireball was going to be. They weren't quite sure about what frame rate they needed. They had set up 52 cameras. And when the detonation occurred, a lot of the films were overexposed. And out of the 52 cameras that they had running, only 4 of them actually produced scientific data.
Three weeks later, they get a second chance when atomic bombs are dropped on Japan.
On the Hiroshima detonation, the photo plane failed to rendezvous with the B-29 bomber that dropped the bomb, and so there was no film record of the Hiroshima shot other than what was taken by one of the scientists. And he had smuggled on his own personal camera, and he filmed the mushroom cloud out one of the windows.
Attempts to film at Nagasaki also fail.
Because the guy that was supposed to run the high-speed cameras didn't have a parachute, they didn't let him on the plane. So again, there was no photographic record other than one camera captured the lake cloud.
But what pictures can document is the horrific, destructive force of America's new superweapon.
An explosion equal to 20,000 tons of TNT brought the greatest man-made disaster in the history of the world. Completely leveled 4 square miles.
For the military, the bombs achieved their primary objective. Japan formally surrenders on September 2nd, 1945. But images of mushroom clouds and destruction don't help scientists understand how the bomb works.
From the first 3 detonations, Trinity, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki, we basically have very little data to analyze.
It's the fireball before the mushroom cloud scientists need to analyze. To learn more, they have to detonate more bombs. July 1946, the Bikini Atoll in the Pacific. The military begins an aggressive atomic weapons testing program called Operation Crossroads.
Photography at Operation Crossroads was a huge part of that project.
It was a major, major adventure for the United States. Crossroads called for over 700 photographers and for thousands of cameras.
Radio-controlled autopilots are installed in 8 B-17 bombers, converting them into drones filled with hundreds of automatic cameras so they could fly directly into the mushroom cloud. The photography team brings 1.5 million feet of film.
Crossroads created a worldwide shortage of film stock. And not only that, camera equipment in the United States. The government had to go to private labs and borrow equipment.
Journalists are also invited to witness Operation Crossroads in a kind of public relations spectacle.
Crossroads was part of an initiative, an effort by the US government to make Americans more comfortable with the bomb, to, in a sense, sort of domesticize it by creating beautiful pictures and making the mushroom cloud itself a kind of cultural icon.
Conditions are perfect for a front row seat to the blast.
The world's 4th atomic bomb plummets earthward. Falling for slightly more than 48 seconds, the bomb explodes. Unfolded are a myriad of majestic, startling, and awesome effects, a panoply that only the cameras can record in faithful detail.
Only they don't. At least, not what the scientists need most. Those crucial first few milliseconds of the formation of the fireball.
The timing mechanism that was supposed to start all the cameras failed, and so all of the scientific films started late, and they were unable to get satisfactory scientific results.
The country that built the world's most advanced weapon is failing to understand how it really works.
What the military learned from photography at Operation Crossroads, that if they were really going to begin to learn more from these weapons, they were going to take a more technical approach to documenting these tests.
Traditional photographic equipment can't deliver. So the military turns to 3 high-tech wartime innovators at MIT, Harold Edgerton, Kenneth Germeshausen, and Herbert Greer, who would go into business as EG&G.
EG&G got involved in the nuclear program right from the beginning because of the expertise they had with photography and flash systems.
They invent ultra-high-speed cameras that can capture atomic detonations in their first critical milliseconds.
You begin to need such precision and such fine slicing of time that you need cameras that don't even look like cameras to our eyes.
One of the technologies that they built was the Rapitronic camera. It was a still camera that could shoot a frame of about 2 milliseconds. These are some of the more spectacular images that you see come out of EG&G work. These sort of almost otherworldly, alien-like fireballs. Through images of the bomb detonating, you could get both to things like yield, how powerful was this bomb, through very careful measurements of photographic frames.
We would take high-speed photography of the fireball, and analysts would measure frame by frame the growth rate, and that was a very accurate yield measurement.
Now, for the first time, they could begin to calculate the impact their weapons would have. It's the critical information needed to build better bombs. And that was the plan, even when America stood alone as the world's sole nuclear power. What all cameras can record, and what the public sees, is an image that would characterize the atomic age. The mushroom cloud quickly becomes an iconic symbol of death and destruction.
By 1948, the White House and the Department of Defense thought atomic publicity was creating more panic and anxiety among the American public than it was reassuring them.
The sense of anxiety would skyrocket on September 23, 1949, when President Truman announces the Soviet Union has tested its own atomic weapon. This is the moment that changes forever the balance of power on a global scale, jump-starting the arms race and redefining virtually all geopolitics through the prism of East-West conflict. America is in shock. The constant threat of atomic attack is now a fact of life, a terror that never goes away.
Only in practice now, but tomorrow this siren may mean the real thing.
America comes out of World War II the most powerful, most prosperous nation on Earth. But now the Soviets have the bomb too. And there's still a lot to learn about the weapon that ended the war. The military is determined to test a lot more bombs and get a lot more serious about filming those tests. For serious filmmaking, there is only one place for the US military to go.
They look for a way to create a routine resource, a routine set of laborers that can be in charge of photography for these bombs. They set up a new place called Lookout Mountain Laboratory.
Hidden away in the hills overlooking Hollywood, the US military starts a new top-secret operation that fulfills two primary needs.
One is secrecy, where they know that they can shoot and develop film on site without sending it out to other locations where it might get eyes on it they don't want. And two is they want to have regular access to people who are experts in the production of motion pictures.
Official designation? The U.S. Air Force 1352nd Photographic Squadron. Staffed by both civilian and military filmmakers, with expertise across every aspect of film production.
Lookout Mountain was arguably the only self-sufficient Hollywood studio in its time. You could shoot an entire movie inside the facility.
That included everything from the engineering and development of cameras through the machine shop and engineers on hand, through the shooting of these images on-site or off-site, to the development and storage of those films. They had script writers. They had musicians and composers to create the scores. They had the prop shops. They had a robust art and animation studio. They had a full-on sound stage. They had sound technicians on board.
No other studio in Hollywood could do that kind of thing all in one space. And Lookout Mountain was set up that you never had to go outside of the walls of the studio.
Crucial, because most of the movies are top secret.
Everybody who worked at Lookout Mountain on a daily basis had the highest form of security clearance, the Q clearance. They had to have that security clearance because they were dealing with the most secret activities of the Cold War state.
It's a mysterious operation, with some staff arriving by school bus. Residential neighbors living nearby have no idea what's happening inside the complex.
Lead animators would be going back and forth between Disney and Lookout Mountain's animation shop. Actors would be going up and down the mountain to take turns with doing voiceover or even on-camera work for some of Lookout Mountain's projects.
John Ford, Jimmy Stewart, Walt Disney, Marilyn Monroe, Kim Novak. I mean, the list goes on and on.
The 50s are a time of dazzling innovations in movie making. Lookout Mountain is often a step ahead of Hollywood in pioneering some of the most advanced technologies.
Lookout Mountain would sometimes serve as a sort of research and development wing for cutting-edge cinematic technologies in Hollywood. They were doing 3D cinema before others were doing it in Hollywood. They were doing CinemaScope many months before the first CinemaScope film was released in Hollywood.
Like Hollywood, Lookout Mountain films often target very specific demographics.
Each film project came with an audience in mind, and those audiences varied widely. Sometimes they were foot soldiers.
If you've ever been on an atomic test before, either here in Nevada or overseas at Eniwetok.
Other times they were military brass.
When the Department of Defense requirements for
only those at the highest levels of the Pentagon.
The various manufacturers under contract for the
Other times it was the general public.
On the morning of shot day, official observers, technicians, and scientists gather at News Knob to await the momentous event.
Lookout Mountain isn't alone. There's an explosion of military filmmaking in the Cold War. While the most highly technical material would remain top secret for decades, the government is eager to exploit the propaganda value of the atmospheric detonations. Atomic saber rattling, a very public warning to enemies, while reassuring allies and the American people that they are being protected by weapons of awesome destructive power.
The armed forces will be ready with the know-how to put them into immediate use. Knowledge for the deadliest kind of atomic strikes on enemy targets. And experience for effective defense of our own cities.
From 1951 to 1957, multiple tests under the code name Desert Rock attempt to prepare troops to fight this new kind of war. Boots on the ground of an atomic battlefield. Camera crews capture troops piling into trenches just a few thousand yards from ground zero and turn the footage into training films.
They created documentaries for military personnel that would be involved in nuclear war fighting, communicating for the soldier that was going to be on the front line.
In 1953, there's still a lot they don't know, especially about the effects of radiation poisoning.
What seems to be the trouble, soldier? You look a little bit worried.
Well, I am, Chaplain. Just a little bit.
Actually, there's no need to be worried, as the Army has taken all of the necessary precautions to see that we're perfectly safe here.
Sir, have you ever been out on one of these shots before?
Yes, I've had the opportunity to see a number of the atomic tests. Well, I am, Chaplain.
For thousands of troops, the Desert Rock detonations are the ultimate leap of faith. Stationed in trenches right out of World War I, waiting for hours in the Nevada sun for the inevitable countdown to Armageddon.
The B-50 type aircraft you see overhead is the drop plane on its bombing run.
Soldiers were involved in various kinds of operations around and nearby those detonations. There were two things going on there. One was a literal experiment on those soldiers to see what the psychic effects would be for seeing a nuclear detonation. So there were all sorts of questions about just psychologically how soldiers would understand the nuclear battlefield, what their reactions would be.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4.
The stage is set for the Desert Rock atomic test in Nevada. Thousands of troops wait in trenches, some just a few thousand yards from ground zero.
Look down and stay down. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Training films made from operations like this prepare troops for both the military tactics and emotional impact of fighting on an atomic battlefield.
The biggest value of the operation is for us to prove to ourselves that it can be done and find any weak points in the training.
A second project was teaching soldiers that the battlefield of the nuclear age would not be so different from the battlefield they knew during World War II, that they could use their skills and that they would be trained to protect themselves on the front line.
Numerous films meant to sort of reassure soldiers of the safety of being at the nuclear test site or train soldiers on how to behave at a nuclear test or in the future occasion of nuclear war.
Even as the effects of radiation become a subject of concern and study, it would still be years before its full impact is understood.
As they enter the blast area, within an hour after the detonation, they realize the danger of radiation sickness from an air burst is slight.
There are early episodes in which radioactive fallout is dismissed as not a major health concern, something that could be handled very easily.
A thorough head-to-foot examination will reveal any accumulation of radioactive material. Vigorous sweeping with a broom removes contaminated dust and dirt from shoes and clothing.
In the end, Desert Rock is comprised of 5 different test operations, each with multiple detonations, 69 in all. More than 50,000 troops participate. Guinea pigs in America's new atomic age.
As Exercise Desert Rock is concluded, initial reactions are, it is possible to utilize an atomic weapon in close support of ground troops in those cases where the conditions surrounding its use are carefully considered.
While training films are seen by thousands of troops, some of the most elaborately produced and most expensive films are seen by the fewest viewers.
The films that Lookout Mountain spent the most time on were called special project films. These would be the films mostly about the nuclear tests themselves.
Film reports were distributed to government officials of various kinds. They could be government officials in the Department of Defense, they could be congressmen, even the president himself.
More and more, policymakers who control Defense Department purse strings get their information on America's nuclear program from military filmmakers.
5 successful airdrops that saved the weapons research program months of time, considerable money, and helped Los Alamos prove the radical new idea of small atomic bombs.
When they produced these for congressmen and for the president, produced them to reassure them. These were highly, highly risky affairs as well as very costly affairs. And both the Atomic Energy Commission and the Department of Defense wanted to reassure Congress and the president himself that everything was under control. Hey, we got this, it's all under control.
But the nation is nervous, locked in an atomic arms race with the Soviet Union, living with a constant state of apocalyptic threat. the Cold War is about to shift into overdrive.
Operation Ivy was a pivotal moment in the history of nuclear weapons and in the Cold War itself.
The U.S. prepares to test the world's first thermonuclear weapon, the H-bomb.
The scale of magnitude here is really hard to comprehend.
Atomic bombs are measured in thousands of tons of TNT. H-bombs in millions. It's the subject of a fierce public battle, whether such a monstrously powerful weapon is necessary or even moral. But after October 31st, 1952, there's no turning back. Elugelab Island is completely destroyed.
This is the largest fireball ever produced. At its maximum, it measures about 3 1/4 miles in diameter. Compared to the skyline of New York, this means that with the Empire State Building as 0 point, the fireball alone would engulf about 1/4 of the island of Manhattan.
We were talking about a scale of destruction here that was absolutely unprecedented.
The blast force at Ivy is 10.4 megatons. More than 500 times the destructive power of the Nagasaki bomb. A huge Lookout Mountain film team captures the first H-bomb detonation.
Lookout Mountain produced a feature-length film about Operation Ivy, and this time they even used an on-screen actor, Reed Hadley, known from the television show Racket Squad.
It's been a pleasure to help bring you the story of Operation Ivy, the work of Task Force 132.
With so few cleared to see the film, the Lookout Mountain Lab produces only 3 prints.
It was screened for a very select audience for Eisenhower and for the cabinet, for members of the Pentagon. And at that point, a lot of folks thought that film would never be seen by another audience.
Reports were that President Eisenhower responded very, very strongly to the film and said every American should see this film.
DT neutrons from the Mike reaction will pass.
But nobody can agree on how much the public should be allowed to see.
A huge argument began amongst multiple agencies within the U.S. government, and for many months, there were debates back and forth.
For more than a year, the film is recut countless times in the Lookout Mountain edit rooms.
The Federal Civil Defense Administration wanted the American public to know as much as possible about the power of these bombs. The Atomic Energy Commission, on the other hand, wanted as little information about Operation Ivy disseminated to the American public as possible. The Department of Defense was sort of somewhere in between. The Eisenhower administration was thinking about this not only from the perspective of domestic policy, but international policy. And so anything that might be released to the American public, they assumed correctly, was also going to be shown to the world.
H-5 minutes. The shock wave will not arrive for several minutes after 0 time. Keep firm footing until after the wave passes.
The end result, a 20-minute version released to the public that had cut out huge parts of the actual bomb test itself.
I've been a member of firing parties before, but this was different somehow.
The new version plays on television and in movie theaters, beginning in April 1954.
Oh, by the way, to help you understand this problem, these weathermen are covering
Reviews pan the film, calling it overly theatrical, with science that's bewildering.
The shorter film ended up somewhat of a flop. It didn't make nearly as much sense as a longer version. All the work that Lookout Mountain had put into carefully scripting and explanation of this terrifying technology, a lot of it was largely lost.
What wasn't lost was the overwhelming sense of a terrible threat that would never go away. The image of the H-bomb's mushroom cloud would haunt the lives of generations. The dangerous standoff in the Cold War teeters on the threat of massive retaliation. Any aggression would be met with total annihilation. mutual assured destruction, MAD.
The idea was that each side would build up their nuclear arsenal till they reached a point where they had enough to destroy the entire world. If one side enacted a first attack, the enemy would still have time to launch all of their missiles and destroy the first attacker. So this was meant to deter any attack because everyone would be destroyed.
It's a key reason both sides put their nukes on public display.
Deterrence only works when your opponent knows what you can do and you can prove it. So the films of these tests performed a central role in deterrence through proof.
It's a time of peace, constantly haunted by the threat of nuclear war. Nuclear films have helped sow atomic anxiety across the country. Now the government hopes they can also relieve it.
In response to this Soviet nuclear program, the United States creates the Federal Civil Defense Administration to do the work of both training and protecting American citizens from nuclear danger.
Only in practice now, a rehearsal, a training exercise.
The Federal Civil Defense Administration launches a massive effort to manage public fear and promote the idea that a nuclear attack can be survived if the American people are prepared.
If one looks through the films and the written materials, one of the recurring refrains is that a nuclear war could break out at any second.
Enemy jet bombers carrying nuclear weapons can sweep over a variety of routes and drop bombs on any important target in the United States.
A crucial aspect of this was to create a productive fear, a kind of fear that mobilized in a military sense for a new kind of war, now known as Cold War.
The FCDA's message is a call to action.
Civil defense will teach you how to take care of yourself, your family, and neighbors, how to get official instructions and act according to plan.
You are afraid of the atomic bomb, but it's empowering. It motivates you to try and do something about the bomb. You can't lob your own bombs at the enemy, but you can protect yourself from the effects of these bombs so that once these attacks happen, if you follow the right procedures, you can come out and recreate society.
First, you'll have to know what happens when an atomic bomb explodes.
Schools sign on early to participate in FCDA programs. A teacher would be the inspiration for one of the FCDA's first films. After describing drills for students to duck and cover.
Duck and cover is a transformational moment in which federal agencies are telling citizens that there is a new kind of danger, literally an existential danger.
They mix animations of this turtle who's wearing a civil defense armband and a air raid warden's tin helmet with live action footage of children.
Duck and Cover becomes one of the iconic propaganda films of the Cold War. For all the wrong reasons.
Duck and cover is probably the most memorable symbol of civil defense, and it's because people laugh at it. But this film fails in being effective because it's so laughable that people don't take the bomb seriously enough and enact duck and cover.
Few Americans may believe they can survive an atomic attack. But in the East-West standoff, there's not much doubt about who the good guys are. Patriotism sells. Companies line up to cash in on the Cold War.
This is the town, a community with a civil defense plan to meet a major disaster. The time is any time.
The Federal Civil Defense Administration never has big budgets. During the Cold War, large organizations and industry groups sponsor government films to have their name or trade associated with civil defense. It's a golden age for product placement.
had a number of industries that saw a brand new market opening up for their products in the event of an atomic attack, promoting different products that they make, but it's also going to promote some very valuable advice on civil defense.
In the civil defense film, The House in the Middle, you see 3 small houses exposed to nuclear blast with a variety of degrees of kemptness. One house has trash in the front yard. The house on the other end has a nice white picket fence and is freshly painted. And the idea there is that it's meant to show how a house with trash is more likely to be susceptible to flames and fire from an atomic blast.
A house that's neglected is the house that may be doomed in the atomic age. I am going to show you how protective measures can help guard your home against the heat effects of an atomic explosion.
The FCDA produces the film, using images of the blast from Lookout Mountain.
The dingy house on the left, the dirty and littered house on the right, or the clean white house in the middle. It is your choice.
Sponsored by the National Cleanup, Paint-Up, Fix-Up Bureau of the National Paint, Varnish, and Lacquer Association.
It's indicative of a lot of civil defense films. They're meant to encourage a certain way of living in the 50s, as much as they are a certain way of managing your fear in relationship to the bomb.
In many civil defense films, it's the American way of life that's under threat. So the FCDA creates an elaborate portrait of how the American dream will stand up against a nuclear attack.
Operation Q is one of the most interesting civil defense films produced. It is the one that tries the hardest to domesticate the bomb.
Here at the Nevada test site, I covered the story of Operation Q, a program to test the effects of an atomic blast upon the things we use in our everyday lives.
The film reflects many of the family stereotypes from television shows of the period.
Home is imperative to civil defense. If you bring these civil defense measures into your home and everyone follows their specific role that's assigned to them, then you will be able to survive the bomb.
Turn off the burners of your gas or electric stove. Disconnect any heating elements, such as electric irons, hot plates, or bathroom heaters.
Women play a central role in the FCDA's vision for the survival of the American family.
In civil defense films, domestication is really important in terms of gender, because the biggest way to domesticate the bomb is to relate it to women. A woman's place is in the home, according to the 1950s stereotype. So she's the one who's in control of what takes place in the home when the blast occurs.
Sponsored by Motorola, an entire film about a nuclear attack on New York City takes place in the suburbs, mostly in one family's home.
In Atomic Attack, Mrs. Mitchell doesn't have a plan for civil defense, and she suffers because of it. The bomb is not domesticated.
Her husband is killed at his office in Manhattan. Her daughter suffers radiation sickness, treated by a doctor played by a young Walter Matthau.
Mitchell, she's going to need a long course of treatment. In plain English, she took in a lot of the particles resulting from the bomb.
Atomic Attack is a really interesting counterexample to Operation Q of a woman not playing her role and seeing her family fall apart around her because of it.
But in the end, Mrs. Mitchell, her daughters, and her home in the suburbs survive. The message? The American way of life is indestructible, literally.
In Operation Q, one of the chief projects was to distribute a variety of different housing styles, populate that with contemporary appliances, with mannequins dressed and posed in kind of moments of everyday home life, and to connect those different utilities, commodities, and clothing to particular manufacturers, some of whom wanted to advertise their projects as bomb-proof.
For films like Operation Q, mock homes whole cities and fake forests are erected in the Nevada desert to see how different kinds of materials and constructions would be impacted by an atomic attack. It produces some of the most memorable images from the atomic tests.
The problem is that the destructive power of the weapons is so vast, instruments that can destroy cities with single devices. The technical capacities of nuclear warfare outstrips the protective powers of civil defense.
The message of survival doesn't match the images. The public isn't buying it. By the late 1950s, the FCDA starts pulling earlier films from distribution when the information proves too unrealistic or just downright misleading.
The majority of people exposed to radiation recovered completely, including a large percentage of those who suffered serious radiation sickness. Today, they lead normal lives. They bear children. Their children are normal.
So the FCDA tries a new tack: bomb shelters.
So if everyone's prepared, if they go into their bomb shelters, they'll survive.
Bomb shelters represent the perfect marriage of civil defense and public relations.
Walt Builds a Family Fallout Shelter was a film that was released instructing people to create block-style shelters to protect themselves and their families from fallout.
Brought to you by the National Concrete Masonry Association.
This shelter is a real good idea. If we should ever have a nuclear war, we could get a heavy fallout even though we were not anywhere near the target area. Thick, heavy walls and ceiling protect against radiation. The thicker, the better. Concrete blocks, therefore, are very well suited for this type of construction.
The idea captures the imagination of the entire country. A poll in the late 50s finds more than 40% of the country is considering building a shelter. But the polls don't tell the whole story.
People said they supported it, but they supported it if the government paid for it. The government didn't want to pay for it.
In the end, civil defense films get a lot of families talking about building shelters, but few follow through. At best, they offer a grim vision of survival, little more than a chance to sit out the apocalypse above.
As a whole, the civil defense films had a neutral effect on the American public. They don't seem to have instilled confidence or motivated people to actually build shelters or participate in evacuations or stock up on food. But it's important to try to understand the way people processed that information.
In 1958, the FCDA evolves into the Office of Civil and Defense Mobilization. More films follow. But the images of nuclear explosions make survival seem patently absurd. October 1963. Just a month before he's assassinated, JFK signs the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, ending all atmospheric detonations. The last pictures of an American above-ground nuclear explosion are taken in a final series of tests at Johnston Island in 1962. The era of nuclear filmmaking comes to an end. After shifting its focus to Vietnam for a few years, Lookout Mountain closes its doors for good in 1969. For decades, films from the early days of the Cold War are locked away, classified, lost, or forgotten. Now, as many are being declassified, an epic project is underway to find and analyze the only images of nuclear explosions we hope we'll ever have. The U.S. conducted its last nuclear test of any kind underground on September 23, 1992. With the Cold War over, the Clinton administration begins releasing nuclear test films to the public that had been classified top secret for decades.
The only reason why we know about the existence of Lookout Mountain and why we have access to these images is because of a declassification process that began in the 90s.
For half a century and more, some of the most technical EG&G films sat idle in cans and boxes, in vaults and basements. Many never opened after the 1 or 2 times they were originally played. Until today, a team at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory is reanalyzing the scientific films of the era.
It's an amazing body of history. The scientific photography is amazing. I mean, they were really forward-thinking about it. It should be preserved, even if it wasn't going to be reanalyzed. The cool thing to me is how much information is there that can be reanalyzed and is valuable to scientists all over.
The value of these scientific films is almost priceless. These films represent the only test data that we're ever going to have of nuclear weapons detonated in the atmosphere. We cannot increase this data because the United States is never going to do another atmospheric test. We did 210 atmospheric shots, and this is it.
Analyzing the images with 1950s technology was no easy task.
In the 50s, when they started analyzing these films, they had to do everything basically manually.
The process was labor-intensive in the extreme. The results, they're now learning, were not very reliable.
This image would be shined onto this grid, and then somebody would sit there and actually try to read it.
They had to position the film, the frame, on the grid manually, each frame, and they had to use that grid to measure the fireball. Hundreds of people for just months, days, years to analyze all of this.
And so there was a large potential for human error.
With some film running at 2,400 frames per second, it could take hundreds of analysts an entire day to study 2 seconds of film. Today, with specialized software and supercomputers, the process is exponentially faster and more accurate.
We can automate the process of analyzing the films. So running a program, it can go through a film of thousands of frames in minutes instead of days.
For scientists reanalyzing the films, the most accurate calculation of yield is still their primary focus. A chilling assessment of a destructive power we hope we'll only see on these films.
EG&G did an amazing job capturing that scientific record in the 50s, 60s, and we're hopefully restoring it for generations, maybe 200 years out, who can look at this and not only get scientific information, but they can know the history firsthand.
The war that would never be fought would become the story dominating the second half of the 20th century. The arms race and the Cold War cast a constant shadow of threat over both sides of the conflict for decades.
Films of nuclear explosions, photographs of nuclear explosions, the iconography of this played such a role in the science and the policy around the bomb that they are now also part of our popular culture as well.
They're an important part of our history. They teach us about the way the government wanted us to view safety and to view something that was terrifying.
Nuclear weapons haven't gone away. The threat remains. But the atomic anxiety in a new century doesn't compare to the overwhelming terror of the Cold War. Yet. But nuclear weapons will always be headline news.
We believe that it is imperative that we be prepared for every disaster, and in today's world, that includes a nuclear attack.
Even before a Cold War-style false alarm of a missile attack, Hawaii started a new generation on civil defense.
Hawaii is now testing their nuclear civil defense sirens in answer to the North Korea threat.
The islands adapted their tsunami warning siren.
This is a test of the attack warning signal.
With a new alert tone, signifying an imminent attack.
Now with the nuclear tensions ratcheting up again, it will be really interesting to see if the language of civil defense begins to come out again, and if it's different from what it was in the 1950s and 60s, or if there's new twists to account for the things we know about those weapons now.
The terrifying threat of nuclear weapons still hangs over the planet. Images of mushroom clouds are burned into our imagination. We built the bomb. The films of the atomic age will never let us forget it.